So the other day, I came across this coffee mug which had printed on it these words: Never Have I Ever 2020 edition. So it had quirky stuff like Never have I ever been in my pajamas for a month, or more philosophical things like Never have I ever enjoyed the little things of life as much. So it made me think that I could add on to the list and say, Never have I ever been out of my comfort zone for such a long time. So here I am, an academician, most comfortable in the classroom, most comfortable in a library or in a conference room. And had it been otherwise, we would have met in an auditorium. But here I am, looking at a blank screen. But I do know my presumed audience would be as much aware of being out of the comfort zone as I am today. And that is why let us face a fact. We are now trying to come to terms with a world that has changed forever. And therefore, it's important, it is time to understand the possibilities of building community networks on a global platform that would negotiate with digital divides and work towards a safer and more equal world. I'm taking into account at this point loss, grief, trauma, particularly among the youth, because I know that they're facing a baffling and diabolical time of challenges. And this is why I want to share the story with them. Because I'm reminded at this point of the wonderful resilience and dexterity of a small indigenous community from the northeast of India. I'm hoping that their story and my story with them will help us face the multiple facets of COVID 19 and its aftermath. I'm talking about the Karbi community in Karbi Anglong in Assam. Why do I want to talk about them? Let me give you a little story. Last year, when we were all so worried about COVID 19 and we were all concerned about keeping ourselves safe, young researchers, young students of Karbi Anglong came together, young professionals, and created a month-long workshop on Indigenous studies. It brought together people across the world trying to tell and share stories of healing and remembrance, stories that would be part of our memory and would help us build our fortitude. But my story with Karbi Anglong begins a little earlier. It begins around in 2008, 2009. I'm a young academician from the city of Kolkata, and I'm taking baby steps then into the vast repertoire of indigenous traditions from the northeast of India. For me, the northeast of India was a profound paradox which simultaneously reflected the frontiers of globalization as well as a heritage of indigenous traditions and cultures. I knew that the Northeast is not simply an abstract political concept or an idea, but through the diverse forms of culture and art emerging from the region, it is an evolving and lived reality. But I wondered how would I experience the same? How to reach a world beyond theoretical presumptions and artistic jargon. This is when friends who were part of Karbi community, and I had met them in Kolkata, suggested that it was time to visit the Karbi Hills. It seemed the right moment because I had an academic project and I was wanting to do something that would be constructive, and they suggested that I should visit Karbi Anglong. In particular, I should visit the Karbi Youth Festival, or what was known as the KYF. So before long, on a cold February morning, I had reached Difu, the central town in Karbi Anglong, in East Karbi Anglong. And nothing had prepared me for the three aspects that I would need to deal with in the few weeks that I spent in Karbi Anglong. One, I had heard about this enigmatic, charismatic, and extremely talented Karbi cultural activist, Mr. Dharam Singh Thenon. and I was looking forward to meeting him in Karbi Anglong. He was there to greet us at the station in Difu, but I was taken aback. Here was a very serious man who didn't talk much, quite taciturn, and I could only mutter a yes sir or a no sir. So I didn't know how I would communicate with this gentleman for the next few weeks. More on him soon. Two, I was also taken aback by the place that I was asked to stay in. They had arranged for my stay at a place called Jasongasong, up on the hills, very pristine, very beautiful. With the solitariness of my room, the whitewashed rooms, very little connectivity, and I think I was one of the few people living there. And there was this other person, but we were just there too, and there would be power cuts, so you were compelled to be on your own. I've often wondered, why did I stay there? And I realized that was part of my learning experience, to be part of the Karbi community, to be part of the hills. The next thing that happened was, of course, Tifu itself. Having grown up all my life in the city, it takes less than 5 or 6 hours to reach Karbi Anglong. If you start in the morning, you're there by late noon from Kolkata. But nothing had prepared me for the images that greeted me in Karbi Anglong. I was taken completely unaware. Now coming back to Mr. Taran. Mr. Taran was one of the most enigmatic teachers that I've come across. I realized he was quiet because he was trying to say how willing I would be to learn, how willing I would be to acknowledge that I didn't know. Thankfully, I was there to learn, and I remember that I was there to learn. And I told myself that it was okay to not know. And Mr. Taran turned out to be a generous teacher. He introduced me to the Taralangso, the beautiful amphitheater built by Karbi youth for the Karbi Youth Festival. He introduced me to the Jambalia Thong, the Karbi totem. He introduced me to the wonderful weaves of Karbi Anglong. He introduced me to remarkable storytellers like Mr. Sikari Tisso, in whom I found another teacher. So this was how I became a part of the Karbi Youth Festival. Now let me tell you a little bit about the Karbi Youth Festival. What became the huge success of the Karbi Youth Festival had very humble origins. It was a small affair that began in 1974 in the Karbi Club in Difu. The Karbi Cultural Society was founded in 1977, and since then, the Karbi Youth Festival grew in strength and further strength. It became one of the most important events in Karbi Anglong, and I was enthralled by the performances that was given by rural folk singers, dancers that came from the 21 zones of Karbi Anglong. And this was funded by the Karbi community. The Karbi community was part of the Karbi Youth Festival. It brought me, therefore, closer to Karbi friends like Rosalind, like Mainu, and others who were there as part of it. The Karbi Youth Festival, I've been to Karbi Anglong many times since then, but the Karbi Anglong does not mean a repository of data. Only Karbi Anglong means family. Karbi Anglong means I get to meet Mr. Batul Tiso, who is working wonders on the urban planning scape of Tifu. I get to meet someone like Mr. Langsing Bay, who speaks 32 languages from Karbi Anglong. We call him the Karbi Google. He can pretty much tell us anything that we want to know. It gave me friendships with people like Maggie, Rosalind, and young people like Sabine, Clindy, Aron, and many others. It gave me the photographies of Lee Akiri. This was one of the most wondrous experiences that I could ever have. So when I returned to Karbi Anglong, I returned to the families of Mr. Inti, Mr. Terron, Mr. Tiso, many names that do not make sense to you. But what I'm trying to tell you is that a community is built by people, is built by relationships that you try to nurture. It has nothing to do with data only. Data is important, certainly, but you cannot build on that data unless you understand the relationships. Like any family, every community gives you a sense of memory, will give you memorable stories. And this is what's important. I'm going to tell you 3 stories such as that happened. One in 2013, I was at UC Berkeley and I was on a Fulbright fellowship. I was teaching people, students over there, and on Indigenous studies. And this is when I thought this was one of the ways of being forward, going ahead. And that's when I thought, okay, let's have Mr. Terron with us through Skype. And that is when we arranged a meeting. So my students from America were out of their comfort zone. Mr. Terron was out of their comfort zone. I was out of my comfort zone because we didn't know how this would go. How would the conversation begin? Where do we start? Knowing. And that's when the meeting went on beyond class hours. And it was one of the most remarkable moments in my life as well, because I could acknowledge Mr. Terron as a teacher. Because it's a community that has given you much, and you must remember how to give back as well. Another landmark memory for us as a community, for us to think in terms of a community, is 2015, when the Center for Karbi Studies was founded. It brought together people amidst adversity. It brought together people despite the many hassles of life, right? And that became a significant part of our story. Remember the workshop that I spoke about in the earlier part of my talk? That workshop was organized by the Center for Karbi Studies. Of course, Mr. Terron helped found it, but these were young people who were part of this. So this was a community that tried to pass it on through generations. Another important event happened in 2018-19 when I received the Fulbright Alumni Award. It gave me a small grant, and that grant enabled me to organize a workshop in Karbi Anglong, bringing together 3 generations of women from Karbi community, talking about processes of healing, processes of resilience, and the power of community. It brought together traditional weavers, storytellers, and this was one of the most beautiful moments that we could have. Those 3 days that I spent with these women before, after the workshops, it was a 2-day workshop, but we had 3 days, and it was one of the most remarkable moments that I could talk about. I could go on talking about that, in fact, but this was one of the pivotal moments for me as a family member of the Karbi community. And it brought us out of our comfort zones into a different sense of comfort, a different sense of strength that can only come from community. You see, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is, as a teacher in comparative literature, as a teacher in the humanities, one engages with a being in the world, a relationship that must be articulated by my praxis and is clarified by a pedagogy. We now live in a world that compels us to challenge known categories of analysis, if only to better understand the inherited geographical and intellectual terrains in our own niche zones of comfort. The Karbi Anglong community helps me to know how to be in this world and not shy away from engaging with difference in the everyday. What's also significant over here is is let's do a brief recap. What was one of the first things that hit us during the COVID-19 pandemic at its worst? What hit us is that we couldn't share a meal, a cup of coffee with our dear ones. Karbi taught me that sharing a meal is one of the most important things that you could do. It's not about research, it's not about data, it's not about academic papers, it's about sharing a meal. And as long as we have that in our heads, the fact that the priority is to be able to share a meal, to be able to live the ordinary everyday life with sharing of meals, I think that will help us through all challenges. So thank you for listening. Makurwangtu, as they say in Karbi. Thank you very much.